night has come and the land is dark.
250,000 tons of concrete, molded by human genius and endeavour. A 1-mile ribbon of steel, forged in the white heat of technology. Something which put British engineering back on top of the world. The Severn Bridge is 50 years old, but its elegance is timeless, and its groundbreaking design continues to be flattered by imitation the world over.
This, then, is the scene set for the royal opening of the Severn Bridge.
It is with great pleasure that I now declare the Severn Bridge open.
The inauguration came 6 weeks after England had won the World Cup, and 6 months after the launch of colour television, a time of huge national optimism.
What a day for a daydream.
As Her Majesty's come, leading this great procession on to the bridge in Severn to make the first official crossing.
1966 was actually a pretty great year for British design, for British music, for British film, for British fashion, for British architecture, for British bridge design. Britain was on a roll.
Bridges have this power to transform and excite a community and to make people really believe in the power of the future in a way, you know, that man's works can actually make life better.
This is the story of the Severn Bridge, told by those who designed it.
Severn Bridge is the most perfect example of a suspension bridge in the world.
It remains the leader of that sort of innovation. Nobody has found a way of doing it better.
And those who built it.
The workforce on that bridge, they were a breed of men on their own.
The older I get, I'm very, very proud of the job and everything that went into the bridge.
But it's also the story of the men who lost their lives in the conquest of Britain's mightiest river.
I always think of it as my father's. Its bridge.
For many of its 200 miles, the River Severn shadows the border between England and Wales. But in its lower reaches, it presents a formidable barrier between the two countries, isolating the industrial powerhouse of South Wales. Once, if you wanted to drive between Cardiff and Bristol, you faced a 100-mile journey through Gloucester and Chepstow, their narrow roads increasingly overwhelmed by traffic. Or you could take a small ferry, but it ran only in daytime for a handful of cars.
The road links into South Wales from England were unbelievably awful. People cannot really envisage how it was. For instance, if you left South Wales and you went to the Beachley Orst ferry, which was the way to get over the estuary, and that ferry didn't always run because of the tide problems, and alongside the road down to the ferry were stakes in the ground which said half an hour, 1.5 hours, 2 hours. That's how long it would take you to get into the ferry. And if it was about 1.5 hours and you wanted to go down, let us say, to Torquay, that was the point. Your father said, OK, go off, up through Gloucester, down the other side. That gives you a flavour. It was unbelievably cut off.
My name is Derek Hudd. I'm 86 years of age. I worked on the Old Passage Severn ferry. It was quite hard work. You were on your feet all the time, most of the time. I, as an engineer, worked down below on the engines. You were also expected to go up on deck and help load the boat as well, which I did. But you never minded that because it was good to get out of the engine room. was cars. There was a queue of cars. It was fantastic. You could have a queue of 100 cars, more. And there was this chap, he was up with his children. And I said, how long have you been here? And he said, oh, we got here at 8:30. Remembering now that this was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said, you know, why didn't you go away? And he said, God, I couldn't do that. He said, the kids and the missus had gone mad.
I used to go and stay near Chepstow. I used to go by ferry. It's a ramshackle affair to get across this wide piece of water. And it was wonderful as a child. When you arrived and you'd go on this old ferry to clunk across them. When you got down the side, people said, you made it all right then? You know, expecting you weren't going to. So the arrival of the bridge was a big deal. A great expression of human endeavour on their doorstep.
The Severn Bridge was greenlit in the 1940s to be the biggest in Britain. The mile-long crossing would follow the same route as the ferry. It would pass through an army camp and over the neighbouring River Wye to complete the link between England and Wales.
My name is Michael Parsons. I'm 87 years old and I am the most senior surviving design engineer for the superstructure of the Severn Bridge.
Wise men say
this was to be the longest span bridge in the world outside of the United States of America. So it had big importance to the firms and to the government. And we were all conscious of the importance of the work we were doing. I was born and brought up in Bristol, so from a very early age I used to go to the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which meant I was inspired with the whole idea of a bridge leaping from one side of a gorge to the other.
The masters of long-span suspension bridges were the Americans, and they made them big. The Golden Gate and the bridges of New York were heavyweight structures with stone towers supporting iron and concrete roadways. But when engineers tried to lighten the load, disaster struck.
A terrifying example of the danger of vibration. The third longest suspension bridge in the world plunges to destruction at Tacoma in the United States.
This was quite a major bridge in the United States, and it was a radical departure from the conventional American design. But the fatal flaw with that design was that it had virtually no torsional stiffness. It was too flexible.
It wobbled itself to death, basically, because there was movement. There's inherent movement in structures. And the great trouble with suspension bridges is that the vibration set up by the wind can be like a sort of semi-perpetual state that increases and increases till the point where the bridge actually falls apart. These were big issues, but the Severn Bridge pioneered certain solutions to that.
Defying the wind was the greatest challenge, and ultimately the bridge's greatest claim to fame. A unique road design would hang from suspension cables draped over 450-foot steel towers. But before all that, the foundations had to be laid in a river infamous for the second highest tide in the world.
Sir John, will you be faced with any particular difficulties bridging the Severn at this point?
We will have to cope, of course, with an extremely high range of tide between high and low water, as much as 40 feet in this case.
So we will be able to get to Wales in comfort by about 1965?
So, yes.
Thank you very much, Sir John.
I'm talking to you from the middle of the M4, the London to South Wales motorway. Or at least it will be the middle of the M4 in 1966.
The BBC reporter Tom Salmon documented the entire construction, beginning in May 1961.
This, in fact, is the long-awaited Severn Bridge, the bridge they've been talking about building now for 100 years.
The first 2 years would be all about the foundations. On either side, enormous anchorages would counter the weight of the bridge, and in the river itself, 2 bases would support the towers. The huge tides made this the most dangerous part of the entire project, especially for the foundation of the East Tower.
I've heard a lot since I've been out here about tidal working. What in fact does tidal working mean?
The tide goes out and the men go down on the blocks. The tide comes back, the men have to get off the blocks and wait for the next time. It's a dog rough job and there's not many men can stick it.
This is a picture of me with our caisson sinking foreman. I had hair then. I'm John Evans. I was the most junior site engineer of the Severn Bridge. We were working in a regime where at a pointed time of day there was 40 plus feet of water. 6.5 hours later you were on exposed rock. 6.5 hours later there was another 40 feet of water. So working in this river with this huge rise and fall was a major civil engineering challenge.
The rock was probably exposed for maximum of 2 hours at low water springs. So you could take a very small area, clean it off, and put a bit of concrete down. And then you come back 12 hours later and do another bit. And some of the lower parts of the rock were literally only exposed for about half an hour at low springs.
I thought the men were brave because of the intimidation of that water coming in. I did feel, yes, a deep admiration for the foundation contractors.
Because of the tides, safety launches were on permanent standby throughout the construction. Their first one was skippered by a local fisherman, Jack Hollins.
I think it's a family thing. My father was in the shipyard. My Uncle Jack was a fisherman. He used to go out and fish for salmon. He worked on the ferry.
In the water and were drifting upstream on the flood tide. In the gathering dusk, one of the ferries set off upstream looking for these men, and by a marvellous set of circumstances, the 3 men were picked up some mile or more above the work site.
Jack Hollins' safety launch had joined the search, but when the men were rescued, he turned for home, unaware that a tanker, the Wisedale H, was heading towards him.
We, on the Wisedale H, were bound for Swansea from Sharpness. As I remember it, it was a very cold night. When all of a sudden, about 6:30 p.m, there was this loud crushing noise, and we thought, crud, we've hit one of the marker posts. And we ran up on deck, and we were shocked to see that we had hit a launch, and the launch was smashed up between the 2 bows, with one man clinging to the wreckage, shouting that his mate was in the water. We turned on the big searchlight which was mounted on top of the wheelhouse, trained it into the water, and we could see this man in the water with his hands above the water and his head there, and suddenly he just slipped away. It was just this vision of this man, and it was...
I'm the eldest daughter of John Newton, who was the first man to die during the building of the first Severn crossing. He was happy, had a lovely sense of humour. He was a lovely father. The body was never found, despite searching and the lifeboat going out, and to this day, never been found. I don't think my mother said anything else other than he jumped into the water to save somebody. Her way was say nothing and just get on with it. And that's what she did.
This was the first incident that had occurred on the construction site where serious injury or loss of life had occurred. And so it was quite a sobering period.
This is the eastern anchorage, and this will take the whole weight of the Severn Bridge. And next time you complain about having to lay a concrete path in the garden, well, just you think of this little lot. It's 140 feet long, 110 feet wide, and 120 foot high. And into it, when it's finished, 90,000 tons of concrete, and 90,000 tons means that it'll weigh more than the Queen Mary.
The concrete consumed vast quantities of stone, pushing nearby quarries to the limit. The area's hotels were stretched to accommodate hundreds of workers coming in from across the country. But local people knew it would all help to relieve their biggest problem.
Before the bridge, Chepstow was a real blockage. There was queues and queues and queues of people. They couldn't get through.
Huge lorries, they would shake the house.
Boom, boom.
And we've even been reduced in very warm weather to go and take drinks outside. The lorry drivers.
Take you home with me. Get my house.
There used to be queues every bloody day. Some days it'd take us about half a day to get to work. With traffic and Chepstow. Crashing, lorries crashing into shops and whatever.
And it was a bottleneck. The famous arch in Chepstow used to be one big congestion.
And when people drive into Chepstow, there's only one object at the moment, and that is to drive out of it if they can. I think once the bulk of the thundering lorries are out of the town, people will want to come to Chepstow.
Personally, I'd rather come down in the bucket. Well, so much then for the anchorage. 90,000 tons of it, 45,000 tons still to go. There's another one just like it on the other side of the river, and they tell me there's quite a bit of rivalry between the two.
We had to establish where the west anchorage was going to be. That was in the middle of the Army Apprentice College first rugby pitch. And one of the early jobs was to take up the turf and get rid of that. Lots of new lawns in Chepstow.
Attention now switched to the base of the West Tower and a new problem. Here, there was no bedrock on the surface, so to gain a solid footing, they had to dig 30 feet below the river, and that meant installing temporary dams to stem the tide.
The cofferdams themselves were in effect a vertical cylinder, 40 feet high, 60 feet wide, and they were formed of sheet piling. You see it on dock walls and places like that.
My name is Graham Nash. I arrived on the site of the Severn Bridge to supervise the construction as a junior engineer. This shows the water coming in through the joints. The cofferdam it would only leak until eventually the tide dropped, and then it would leak the other way. Then a conventional method for sealing these leaking joints was to pour ashes down the outside, and it was quite fascinating in the way in which the water jets just reduced away to nothing. So we had faith in the structure, and so once you've got faith in the structure, you put on your wetsuit and your helmet and you go down there.
We were working something like 60 or 70 feet below the tide level outside. And as a ferry went past at high water, you could hear the thump, thump, thump of the engines and the screws. And sometimes if the ferries came a little bit too close, you'd get an extra drenching down below.
It was an exciting job too. I mean, it was, make no mistake, we knew we were building something quite historical.
The weather was also making history in 1962.
The first inkling we had that we were in for something exceptional came the weekend after Christmas.
We had the coldest spell of weather I can remember. Salt water in the river, and it became full of ice floes. If you were down at water level on the bank, it looked as though there were enough there to enable you to walk across. That was quite remarkable.
Before the first snow had even looked like melting, in fact, while most of it was still lying where it had fallen, there came another and even greater blizzard. Again, it was the southwest that bore the brunt.
Throughout this period, we continued working, and towards the end of February and into March, the local quarries had to give up. The temperatures were so low that the crusher jaws, which are cast iron material, were shattering in the cold.
Motorists were advised to take no journeys whatsoever, not even essential ones. 1962 went out with the southern half of Britain littered with abandoned cars.
The winter also saw the second fatal accident, and it involved another safety launch.
There was always a safety boat, and it was out there 24 hours a day, so that it could go to assist if it was needed. And one night during the night shift, it broke away from its mooring and smashed into the pier or one of the, I'm not quite sure what. It was all very sad because I think we lost 2 people with that one.
Both men were locals. One was from Bristol, the other a father of 4 from the Forest of Dean, Albert Nelms.
He was a family man. He didn't have a trade apart from he started to go fishing when there was not much work around in the 30s.
Because it was out of season and he always got a job. Sometimes it was building, anything he could do for the few months, obviously to keep us 4 children.
Well, I went down on that morning to pick him up because we were sending some cattle to market. They'd said that there had been an accident.
I was at school in the 6th form and the headmistress came in, stopped the lesson and called me out, and my sister was outside waiting and said that Dad was missing.
It wasn't until later on in that day that we were told that they'd found his body in the launch, like. Obviously the tide is quite fast running in. Gone into one of the stanchions uprights and capsized.
Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the 6th biggest bridge in the world takes shape.
Despite the setbacks, the foundations were completed on schedule. The anchorages on each side and the bases in the river ready for the towers. It was time for the concrete mixers to give way to the steel erectors.
It wasn't exactly exciting doing the foundations, really. It was interesting, but it seemed to be slow. You know, it took 2 years to get that pier constructed. But once we started to erect the towers, I think then it began to strike home that we were really going up.
A lot of people think that the towers of the bridge are made of concrete, but in fact they consist of steel boxes bolted one on top of the other.
When you build a suspension bridge, because of the curvature of the earth, if each tower is vertical, they're actually not parallel to one another because of the centre of the earth down here. And believe it or not, that is allowed for.
If you want to get an idea of the precision of the job, just consider. When the towers were completed, they were strained outwards exactly 32 inches. When the centre span is completed, they will lean inwards exactly 8 inches. And when the side spans are added,
the towers end up vertical. Isn't that miraculous?
And on they went. 2 towers, 1,200 tons each, erected in 8 months.
the next thing they had to do was to join the towers together. They had to get a piece of wire across 3,000 feet of water. Well, this they did quite simply by loading a huge reel of wire onto a barge and driving it across and paying out the wire as they went and letting it rest on the river bed.
The demand for wire was insatiable, the length almost enough to encircle the planet.
I'm Howard Peterson, and I left my father's farm and went to work in the winding shed. I've never seen anything like it before. The machinery and the coils are starting to come in, and what the devil do I do with this lot? They would come in on lorry loads would come in. You cut the bands on these coils and it could fly anywhere if you don't have it under control, and then reel it onto the main drum, which was like a giant cotton reel. The big drum was offloaded and taken away ready for spinning across the bridge. And the foreman came to me one day and said, "I've got another job for you. I want you to go and you be labourer to the carpenter."
I just don't know what to do with myself.
That was the first time I'd been up the tower.
They then put square pieces of steel mesh to make footwalks from one side to the other.
To look around and see for miles, and then you think, God, I'm about 450 foot up. Never been up this high before, you know. And I looked over the side then, and had a look down and see the safety launch more below. And it was like dots down below. It was unbelievable. So you go to the handrail. One time the handrail wasn't there. It would have been open. Men were working on the top of this structure, and they had to work right on the edge of the structure to put the handrails around. You can't envisage being in that situation.
The first wires were there simply to support the catwalks, but now it was time for the main cables from which the road deck would hang, and they were a different matter altogether.
And I think this is just about the finest argument I've ever heard for giving up smoking. And this is one of the main cables of the bridge, looking rather more substantial up here than it does from down below. And this, I suppose, to the layman is just about the most baffling bit there is of bridge building. How do they get a cable as massive as this one across the river?
Okay, now. It's a process whereby you pull a loop of this up over the towers, across the main span, up over the other tower, and down to the far anchorage. And then the carrying device comes back with a loop of wire again, and it goes back and forth, back and forth.
Cable spinning, as it was known, was relentless. 16 hours a day for 6 months until 18,000 miles of wire had been spun across the river.
All right, Rob, settle it up.
And for the whole 6 months, only strong winds gave the steel erectors any respite. Food and drink was brought to them on the catwalks as the spinning went on.
I'm Brian Hughes, and I worked on the Severn Bridge, supplying the men that were spinning the cable with tea and soup. My job actually was delivering the tea down to the men on the catwalk. It takes about half hour to walk down there and back, with the tea on the back of it. But it was all right.
They would God. Everything a steel erector wanted, he had to have. And when the steel erector was unhappy, he'd be for the high jump. Our tea room was bolted to the side of the tower, and you'd enter through the roof, like go down the ladders, just like you went into a submarine.
And the towers was moving easy, good 4-8 foot from side to side. Because when he was in that canteen down the side of the Boston, you put a cup on the end of the table, he moved from one side back to the other. Even a full cup of tea, man.
When the weather was bad and the guys had to come in, I suppose they wore out more packs of cans than any other industry I know.
The sound of the pulleys pulling the wires across was very distinctive. It was a sort of tinkling, clanking noise, and you could hear this going on from early in the morning until late in the evening.
Spinning continued day and night through the summer of 1964. It became a way of life.
The team were very keen on skittles, and we became interested in the possibility of competing with some teams from Chepstow. Once or twice we drove round the top and down to Chepstow, and that meant a very late return home at the end of the evening. And then someone said, well, why don't we walk across? The lights are always on, they're always safe. And so we used to walk across and have our skittles and then have a beer and walk back again. It was a very good way of spending an evening.
On the deck, on the top of the towers, there was a portable loos. We had a guy there that looked after the loos. And he stunk that much, we wouldn't let him in our tea hut, so we used to bolt the hatch down. And I don't know what possessed the man. He came to empty the toilets and threw the bucket of waste over the side and didn't even look to see where it was going to land. And unfortunate, the safety launch.
Beautiful day, sun was shining, and we heard a splitter splatter which sounded like heavy rain. I went out of the wheelhouse and found that somebody had tipped the contents of the chemical toilet, and most of it had landed on us.
The gaffer came rearing in to the tea hut and give us boys a real dressing down about throwing the bucket waste over the side of the bridge. I said, well, it wasn't us, you better go and examine what the contents are, and you could see it wasn't our fault.
And one of the steel erectors slapped me on the shoulder and said, it must be your lucky day, what are you backing on the horses?
Once all the wires are in position, they are compressed into a circle and clamped together at a controlled tension. Each cable is now ready to take a load of 10,000 tons, and the equation is almost complete.
The final stage of construction was where the Severn Bridge achieved its greatest innovation. Today, the old shipyard in Chepstow shows little sign of its groundbreaking role in civil engineering history. But this was where they built the bridge's revolutionary roadway.
This is the first time a box structure had been made of this shape or this size. It was built from stiffened plates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we all knew this was an innovation. And I think we all wanted to make a success of it.
Well, I could describe it as a spaceship. The wind coming up the river, they were designed for it to go underneath and up and over. So it was a aeroplane shape, really. But you know, I do believe I'm there. I'm looks like we're discussing whether it's time to go for lunch.
The plated box design was a response to the Tacoma disaster in 1940, but it took 20 years for the idea to gain favour. Those winds had sent shockwaves through the world of civil engineering.
Fortunately, the only casualties were a car stalled on the bridge and a dog.
As a result of the failure, we in this country decided that we would have to stick to the open truss, as in all previous American big bridges.
The classic American truss deck comprised a heavyweight lattice of steel girders under a concrete roadway. And right up to the start of the Severn Bridge construction, this was the plan that was being fine-tuned in the wind tunnel. But the design team, led by a taciturn Welshman called Gilbert Roberts, already had the plated box in mind. They just hadn't had the time or opportunity to test it.
A very good solution had been found to the problem of Tacoma Narrows by making it with open work trusses.
As the wind stream meets the front girder, it divides and curls round the top and bottom edges of the girder.
But this had the cost of considerably increasing the actual ordinary wind forces. And the way to get around that would be to make them much more like an aircraft wing. And Gilbert Roberts wanted to test the new aerofoil type there. But this was unprecedented, and wind tunnel testing time is scarce and expensive.
And then one day, Gilbert came over into the office and said the model that they were testing in the wind tunnel has broken loose from its anchorages and has smashed itself.
The man responsible was seriously worried, thought that Roberts would be highly critical. I'm dreadfully sorry, Mr. Roberts, but we've just broken the model. And it wasn't in Roberts' nature to say, hooray! But that was his reaction, in fact.
So I said, well, the time has come, I think, sir. He was sir to me. I think the time has come, sir, that we've got to think about the possibility of using the plated box.
So out went the heavyweight truss, and in came the plated box, a third of the depth and half the weight. It sailed through its tests and went quickly into construction. A stroke of genius with a touch of serendipity.
It was streamlined, which meant that the wind forces were less. It used less steel, and therefore it weighed less. And therefore you produced both the lateral forces and the vertical forces. So there were savings on the cables, on the towers, and on the anchorages, because the tension of the cables was less. And if you add all those savings together, it is immense.
One of the towers of one of the big American bridges contained more steel than the whole of the Severn Bridge. And you know, I think when this was pointed out to the American engineers, they got a bit annoyed, really, and thought that we'd been cheated.
The Americans might have envied another benefit of the boxes, that they could float and therefore be towed down to the bridge. The first of 88 that would span the Severn was launched in September 1964.
All the dignitary were watching and all ready on the sides of, and he had to give it a blow with a hammer, and the pin flew up, hit the hammer with his hand up in the air, caused quite a lot of amusement. But slowly the unit started up and slowly launched itself into the river. No problems, all perfect. Much to our delight and relief.
Slender, streamlined, almost fragile-looking, their appearance conceals a strength and solidity which will allow winds of 100 miles per hour to blow harmlessly round them.
The road sections of the bridge are made of steel. In fact, they really are just a series of steel boxes which have been made up in the steel yard at Chepstow and then launched into the River Wye down a slipway.
A special barge was built to collect the boxes and take them to the bridge. Called the Severn Nave, it had no rudder and was steered by 4 outboard engines, one on each corner.
My name's John Roberts. I was a deckhand on the Severn Nave in 1964. Just waiting for the sections to come into the water, and then we'd get hold of it and secure it. It was a very nice job to work on. We used to look at each other and say, they pay us for this.
The skipper of the Severn Nave was Jack Hollins, the man who'd survived the fatal accident on the first safety launch in 1961. Now his knowledge of the river would prove invaluable.
Jack had always worked on the river. He was a fisherman, operated one of the stopping boats in the Wye. Very skillful. He was just always in control. He used to see things before they happened.
Jack was tall, dark and handsome, and he was always part of our lives as children. And we used to go and stand at the end of Raglan Way, and we could look down on the Wye River, and it was something to see. It was really like looking at a submarine, actually, very large, wide submarine.
The main part of the road decking, as they call it, is 80 feet wide, and there'll be 4 traffic lanes, 12 feet wide, 2 in each direction.
All the sections for Severn were brought down the Wye past our construction work, and then we would go round to the Beachley Point and watch the work of lifting the Severn units.
To form the roadway, the 88 boxes had to be hoisted into position, a job demanding patience and seamanship.
The tide doesn't run truly underneath the bridge. You can get parts of it where it's running upstream and another part where it is running downstream, both at the same time. So Jack had to manoeuvre this vessel into position underneath the lifting tackle, and it would have been a fairly tricky job to do.
We get the sections, bring them out into the Severn, drop anchor 50 yards, 100 yards before the bridge, and then you let it out on the winch and just drop it down under the bridge.
You've got to have good visibility. You've got to have wind less than 30 knots, and preferably no snow and ice.
They also needed particular tides, which meant it would take 18 months to complete the task.
I don't think there was any other skipper around that could have done it myself. Don't know, but I had a lot of respect for him.
When we were building Suspension Bridge, the classic way was to start at the towers and work both into the side spans and then into the main span. Whereas at Severn, the first boxes were lifted in the middle. And immediately you began to see what a huge structure it was going to be.
And then just behind me, the winches which are used to winch and hoist the main road sections into position. And if you walk to the very edge of the tower and look out over, you can see the sections of roadway, or decking as they call it, that have already been hoisted into place.
And of course, the ferries used to pass underneath the works, so everybody could see what was going on, and it generated huge interest locally.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing.
There's a lovely moment in the story of the evolution of Severn Bridge where none other than Bob Dylan, one of the greatest stars of the day, turns up. Barry Feinstein took this wonderful photograph where you see Bob Dylan in the shades looking very cool. But what's exciting, I think, is the fact that this was the very tour that Bob Dylan changed from his acoustic set to playing electric. He was changing. The times, in his own words, were a-changing. And there is Bob Dylan standing at this very moment of great change in British culture, popular culture, and, of course, how remarkably, in civil engineering too.
Oh, the times they are a-changing.
I remember the bridge was being built. It was a sight to see, of course. And this has been a memory I've carried with me. And that the understanding that bridges have this power to transform and excite the community and to make people really believe in the power of the future in a way, you know, that man's works can actually make life.
In the garden, Jack got stung by a bee, and because the traffic was stopped, he was unfortunate the doctor who had to run couldn't get to him in time to give him the injection, and he died in the garden.
Disbelief. Yeah, disbelief.
He'd survived all sorts of things, and to die from a rather paltry thing like a bee sting was just unbelievable. But that's when his luck ran out.
We didn't know what they would do, the bridge builders or whatever. So I ended up in charge of the Severn Nave.
March the 1st, 1966, St. David's Day, and the last section of roadway to go in.
The last section was at Beachley on St. David's Day. Just drove it around on the engines with the anchor secure. When it was in position, it was hoisted out the river.
I think the man who designed and built the bridge, very, very clever. How everything fitted, everything went together, everything come together smoothly.
That was the end of the job. But it was a good job.
No colors anymore, I want them to turn black.
After over 5 years of the most advanced engineering, 4 men on their hands and knees did the final job because no one had yet invented a machine that could tarmac the roadway. 2 decades in the planning, 6 years in the making, and 5 months ahead of schedule, the Severn Bridge was fit for a queen.
This, then, is the scene set for the royal opening of the Severn Bridge.
An occasion of such importance that the BBC scheduled 2 hours of live coverage.
We all went on Gloucester to a course where the Queen appeared, and she was introduced to everybody, dignitary and from far and wide.
Sir Gilbert Roberts sponsored the design of the superstructure of steelware.
Magnificent lady that she is.
Mike Parsons, opening the Severn Bridge on and off for 17 years.
I was much more almost servile in those days, faced with the Queen. I see the pictures of myself slightly down, with my hand held out.
Now John Roberts, he's 25 years old, he's from over on the other side, from Chepstow.
Met the Queen.
Eventually he became skip of the Severn Nave.
I was called round to Mr. Hoyer's office. He thanked me and he said, for what you've done, I'd like you to meet the Queen.
So
below us now, the klaxon horns are sounding from the boat.
There's something very special about seeing a very light structure, especially a bridge, crossing a great big landscape. So at that point, you might expect a bridge to be this mighty great stone or concrete construction to take you safely across, and what you find is very filigree and fine indeed.
The overwhelmingly simple fact about all this is that nowhere in the world is there a bridge like this one. The lightest for its length and strength ever built. Techniques used in its construction are already being copied and will certainly continue to be copied, not only in this country, but in all parts of the world.
The breakage of the model was completely crucial. It opened the door to testing the new scheme, and the new scheme at that time was completely innovative for long-span bridges.
And later, she's to see the Concorde, now building at the BAC's Filton factory. So quite a day this for British engineering.
I think as a nation at that time, we did feel supremely confident. I personally felt I could do anything. I know it's ridiculous, really. Everybody felt confident for the future.
The idea of a bridge to span the Severn has been a vision for many years, and as an advertisement for the ability of British engineers and constructors, and shows just what can be achieved. It is with great pleasure that I now declare the Severn Bridge open.
The bridge was considered so special that an orchestral piece was commissioned for the occasion. It was commissioned actually by none other than the BBC. It was a work called Seven Bridge Variations, written in 6 connecting parts by 3 Welsh and 3 English composers. The French had done this quite a bit over the years, celebrating engineering structures with modern music. The British came in, this Anglo-Welsh venture, rather beautiful.
A year after the royal opening, a second plaque was unveiled to commemorate the 6 men who lost their lives in the construction of the Severn Bridge. Remarkably few, perhaps, for such a perilous project. In 50 years, many more of the 400 who built the bridge have passed away. But those that remain preserve their memories with great pride.
At the end of the day, we had a party, and we all got very merry, and that was it. Some years after I finished on the ferry, I thought, well, I'll paint a picture of the last day. And I just sat down and painted this. I like Rob Duffy, and I try to paint like him, but his paintings look very easy to do. But no, it's not easy. No, it wasn't easy to do. But I just painted it. And there it is.
I've got shallots in the corner now, waiting when they grow up. They'll be pickled onions for pickling. Broad beans, leeks, and this is the walkway from the Severn Bridge. Oh, and by the way, I've forgotten to mention my rhubarb. You can see how strong, you can put all the pressure on it. And it's perfect, not having to rust after 50 years.
I think the bridge today looks just as fine as what it was when it was first built. I can remember coming back from holiday and looking down the plain, and you could see the bridge. Absolutely perfect. That made me feel proud. I'm glad we landed.
It has an inherent beauty, doesn't it? Between the towers is suspended this cable, which takes this particularly strong characteristic form of a parabolic curve. And I suppose part of the great success of the Severn Bridge truly is the fact it is simply beautiful, like a great work of art.
It looks right to people who don't know anything about engineering. They can see how it works. It's like hanging washing on the line. You know, you can see how the washing is supported by the thin wire. But it is a fact that if it looks right, it's a good indication that maybe you have got it right.
So right that the Severn Bridge design has been adopted by every subsequent long-span suspension bridge. And Mike Parsons and his team won a prestigious engineering award, sharing it with the inventors of the jump jet.
Are you all right?
This is a form of stability I've never investigated. I received the Robert Award as part of the prize given to Freeman Fox and Partners for the design of the Severn Bridge. And this was the first one that has ever been awarded. But I think they picked a good one to start with.
20 years ago, the second Severn crossing created a more direct route for the M4 and prompted questions about the future of the old bridge that continue to this day. But for the men who built it, there'll only ever be one way.
It remains the leader of that sort of innovation. Nobody has found a way of doing it better. And I always use the old Severn Bridge whenever I have occasion to go to South Wales.